This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I hope that you had a nice break and that you're back from lunch. I'm Giorgio Leali. I'm a policy reporter with Politico, based in Paris. And today we will be discussing about trade deals in this very interesting panel on keeping the bloc's agriculture ahead of the game. Before introducing our panelists, just an idea of what we will be discussing. So, first of all, we will look at the fact that agriculture is still at the center of the European Union trade policy and of trade policy in general. And of course, even if we've seen that trade policy is now focusing on, of course, many other sectors, agriculture is still there and playing a key role. We will, of course, discuss as well about sustainability, the tensions that we sometimes have between trade policy, sustainability, and the complementarity between the two. Just another important thing, a reminder that you are encouraged to ask a question by using the Swap Card application. I will have them on my iPad, and I will be very happy to ask them to our speakers. And you can also tweet about this panel. You are encouraged to do so. The hashtag to use is Politico AgriFood. So I'm very happy to have today with us John Clark, who is the Director for International Relations at the Director General for Agriculture at the European Commission, and who has been a trade negotiator for 30 years at the Commission before moving to a new step of his career. So we're very happy to have him today with us. We also have Christina van Bergen, who is a visiting professor at the European University Institute in Florence and also a senior expert at the European Commission. Louis Hintzen, who is senior manager at Food Drink Europe, so he's working on trade for Food Drink Europe, which represents the interests of the food and drink industry in Europe. And we have Jean-Marie Pogan, who is Deputy Director General at the World Trade Organization. So thanks to the four of you for being here. I'm very happy. And I would just start directly with you, John. Since you have a long career as a trade negotiator, I was wondering whether you have, what I was saying before, do you have this feeling that agriculture chapters in trade agreements are still the trickiest part? And we have many examples, even recent ones. Do you have this feeling?
Well, thanks very much for the introduction. Certainly agriculture is always at the heart of our trade agenda and at the heart of our free trade agreements, because it's a sensitive sector, it's sometimes controversial. But if you look at the facts, Europe is very successful. For 11 years ago, we overtook the USA as the world's biggest exporter of agri-food. About 14% of our production in Europe is exported and growing. And we've been, I would say, quite successful in our trade deals in getting a good result for European agriculture. And why is that? First of all, you know, the CAP reforms over 20 years have made us more competitive across the board. Secondly, demographics. The populations are growing, they need food. Thirdly, Europe has a very good reputation for high quality and safety and so on. And fourth, our trade policy, our trade agreements have been very, very successful. And it's very important that we negotiate trade agreements, that we follow the WTO rules, because trade openness is really key for food security. As we've seen, you know, in the 2008 financial crisis with COVID, and more recently with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we need to have open markets and the flow of trade in agri-food products for our European and global food security. So my experience over several decades of negotiations is that agriculture is not the negative element in our trade policy. It's actually a net positive. And I give an example before stopping. 7 or 8 years ago, or 6 years ago, we negotiated the FTA with Canada, the CETA agreement, and the popular view was that the roof would fall in, the world would end. This disastrous agreement for Europe. What's happened? We have a massive trade surplus with Canada. As Sherlock Holmes said, CETA was the dog that did not bark in the night. Yeah, and I think we've had the same kind of very positive results with Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and many other FTAs. So I'm quite confident in the years ahead that we can continue to pursue a very positive trade policy in agri-food for the benefit of our farmers and producers.
Thank you. And I mean, you mentioned, of course, that indeed CETA, it's a good example of how trade policy can be contentious, especially with public opinion. We have seen this. I mean, we're in Paris, in France. We have seen a lot of pushback against trade deals, CETA in the past, and Mercosur for years, and now again. That's definitely something that we will discuss a bit later. But I was wondering, when it comes to the success of the EU trade policy, I had a question for you, Christina. Do you feel that the trade policy and concluding trade deals is also some kind of influence tool or soft power for the European Union to set higher environmental standards, or to be a bit an agenda setter also on the global stage when it comes to these rules?
Yes, this is a very good question. I think that nowadays we need a strong partnership on due diligence with countries all over the world, especially with big countries such as India, Brazil, and we can wonder, how can we do this? Well, we have the tools. We, for example, let's take the example of Uzbekistan. We know that for decades children were subject to forced labor, and just here the Uzbek cotton industry was free from ban. So, and we have many other examples, but this was the result of work between the government and ILO on legislation, on social dialogue, consumer awareness, and all these issues that you know very well. I think that we need to fix a strong global basis on due diligence, because we have these kinds of Paris Agreement. We have also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, and these are our frameworks, are very important. This is a new science for sustainable development. And how we can achieve these ambitious goals through a kind of international voluntary principles, which are in United Nations guidelines for human rights and business, on renewed OECD guidelines for multinational companies. But we can wonder, are these international voluntary principles enough? Is enough to have a kind of gentleman pact on sustainability? We know that everyone knows to speak the same language, so we need to have the same knowledge, the same understanding of due diligence. Consumers need to be informed with the same kind of information, same standardized information. And we, for example, I can tell you, because I'm working just now in Florence, and at the Robert Schuman Center, we have a multidisciplinary team working on the implementation of mandatory legislation on online markets. And the European Commission now understood that we need mandatory legislation, and we have this kind of directive on due diligence, which I hope, which holds companies responsible for the implementation of sustainability. It's a kind of behavior directive. It's not only about reporting. We have another directive about reporting, but it's very important in order to ensure a kind of predictable, reliable framework. This is what we need. And I hope that after the adoption of this directive, I hope that it will be by the end of the year, Europe will act like a force in the global development, and they will push for a kind of, I don't know, international treaty, binding treaty on sustainable development. And for this, we need a very strong partnership. We need a strong partnership. To give you an example, for example, DG INPA in the European Commission working on international partnership needs to work with United Nations in a co-creative spirit, to quote the General Director of DG INPA, Mr. Kundunz, who speaks always about these issues. And so we need to, how can I say, to not only have political discussion, technical discussion about sustainability, but also about capacity building. We need programs for companies in developing countries that are able to follow our regulatory movement on sustainability, because I'm sure that there are companies who are interested to know more about the rationale of this directive on due diligence. So we need to have not only go further with a kind of regulatory aspect, we need to provide assistance. We need to support. It's like a technical assistance. We need to be focused, and this is a big question. So I'll stop here, maybe.
Thank you, Christina. I mean, I think you highlighted a key point there, which is, of course, trade policy is about trade negotiations, but it's also about how the economic actors manage to then make the most of it and really use the potential that is given by free trade agreement. And that's why I would like to ask to you, Louise, because it's interesting to see how the industry is normally in favor of more trade deals. Do you have the feeling that when it comes to the European Union, we had a bit of a slowdown last year in the conclusion of new trade agreements, but now things are accelerating again? Like, are you worried about the fact that that the trade deal conclusion agenda is not going fast enough, or on the contrary, you feel that you're optimistic about?
I would say I'm optimistic. We're optimistic, despite the circumstances. Maybe to provide a little bit of context. So the European food and drink industry is a very diverse industry. We represent more than 290,000 companies in Europe. That's very vast, and they're spread across the entire region. In the European Union, of course, the single market, the internal market, is our biggest market where we source and trade. We source about 70% of the EU's agricultural output. The rest we get from elsewhere. So trade is hugely important, and this means also external trade. And we've been very performant, and as John has explained, the EU trade policy agenda has certainly contributed to this a lot. We have more than 40 FTAs with more than 70 countries in the world. No other country in the world has this. So there are tremendous opportunities we have to diversify our supply chains, to tap into new markets that are outside of the European Union, growing market, emerging markets. But what is true at the same time is that, of course, the EU trade policy context, which is increasingly influenced by geopolitical developments, has evolved over time. We're no longer negotiating the traditional FTAs as we did 20 years ago, when it was primarily about market access. The domestic policy context has changed. We have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We have multilateral agreements that go beyond the liberalization of tariff lines that countries and regions such as the European Union have started to integrate into trade agreements. So in that sense, the trade policy context has shifted. FTAs take longer to negotiate. Not only, I would say, because of these additional provisions that take time to discuss with trading partners, which may have very different views on specific issues linked to sustainability also, but also in other areas. And this can prove sometimes very difficult. At the same time, I think this willingness to continue with the trade agenda is clearly there. Mm-hmm. One of the guiding questions for the panel today was whether Mercosur would set the pace for future FTAs. Personally, I don't think so. I mean, Mercosur is, an animal of its own. It's taken more than 20 years to negotiate. Who knows what we may see in the coming weeks. But if I would look at the pace, maybe the State of the Union address of the President of the European Commission can give maybe an indication, at least what's expected from the European Union to conclude with Australia as well before the end of the year.
Yep.
And then other negotiations which are taking place at the moment with India, with Indonesia, possibly to come early next year. So, I mean, the trade agenda continues, it keeps going. But of course, times have changed. Geopolitics has a lot of influence. Trade is being politicized a lot, also in other regions of the world. And we see friction, of course, between major players. Take, for instance, the United States and China.
Yeah.
So we're keeping a very close eye. And just to finish maybe on the importance of trade, I mean, both the multilateral trading system, immensely important. We've just been there, and I was telling Mr. Pogam with a business delegation just 2 weeks ago, we go there on an annual visit to connect with the WTO Secretariat, which does tremendous work on a day-to-day basis, which is not necessarily visible to the outside world, because often we mostly talk about the negotiations that don't necessarily deliver or materialize, or where only very little achievements are then kind of, publicized. But the day-to-day work of the Secretariat, like the TBT and SPS committee work, is tremendously important for international companies that want to internationalize.
Definitely. I mean, it's a perfect transition to the question I want to ask to you, Jean-Marie, because it's true that there is a big focus, of course, even from us, the press, on when things don't work, because this shows some political dynamics around trade, some problems. But it's interesting to understand better what's the role of the WTO. How would you describe it as a facilitator, for example, for the conclusion of trade deals, and how the multilateral trade dimension plays in this context?
Well, thank you very much, Julio, and I'll bounce back. Thank you on your words. Actually, the role of the WTO remains very central for two obvious reasons. First, 75% of world trade in agriculture and other goods remains based on WTO terms, what we call most favored nation. And second, there are issues which can only be dealt with at a multilateral level. For instance, because you have a free rider problem. For instance, anything related to subsidies needs to be discussed not in an FTA. It's worthless if you reduce your subsidies here and somebody raises there. You got nothing. And take an obvious example is a negotiation happening in the WTO on fisheries, subsidies to fisheries. If you reduce your fisheries not at the multilateral level, the fish doesn't care about your territorial water, so you have to do it simultaneously. So for this reason, it's quite central. Second element is that regarding sustainability, the framework of the WTO is very conducive if we use it properly, because we have market tools to incentivize innovation for sustainable agriculture, for instance, and you create, of course, a much more appetite for investment if you target the global markets rather than a national one. We have regulatory tools, you mentioned them, sanitary and phytosanitary measures we discussed. And we influence fiscal tools also, because we have all this bunch of subsidies we call distorting trade subsidies that we need to reform in the WTO. And they represent approximately the total of agricultural subsidies is close to 800 billion. Distorting is 400 billion. So if we repurpose this toward more environmental friendly agricultural policies, then we help climate change. So all this is good, and I would echo what John said about the positiveness of the agricultural contribution. Now, the truth is that we have a much more heterogeneous membership in terms of level of development, level of interest, and it's much harder and slower, of course, to find negotiating compromise on issues like food security, which was mentioned, or sustainability for another. And from that point of view, I'd like to flag that the European Union is very much seen as a first mover in all these matters related to sustainability. And I think it's all good for in many respects. But be aware that it steers also a lot of concerns, especially from developing countries, who ask themselves, how are we going to cope with all those new regulations, deforestation? So there is a space for outreach, cooperation, and this is what we are calling for in the WTO Secretariat. so that we avoid the risk of fragmentation and weakening of global cooperation. I stop there. I'm ready to come back on it.
Thank you. You brought on the table, I think, many of the things that we will discuss later, and especially this dynamic where there are. It's true, the European Union has probably the best environmental standards of the world, maybe I would say. But then, at the other hand, it's hard to ask trade partners to comply with the same standards. And I mean, the EU-Mercosur deal has been mentioned, so I would like to maybe spend a little bit of time talking about it, because it's true that it's an animal on its own, as you said, Luis. But at the same time, it really epitomizes all the discussion that we have around trade deals. So I would like to ask to you, John, whether you think, first of all, that the goal that has been set by the Spanish Council presidency and by the Commission president to conclude negotiations by the year end is still an achievable one, because we know that at the beginning of October there will be another round of negotiations. We know that Mercosur countries are really unhappy with the environmental demand that the European Commission has done. So there are many reasons to be a bit pessimistic on that. What is your point of view?
Well, I would. One of my colleagues at the office said he would only bet 10 euros on Mercosur being concluded by the end of the year.
Not much.
So that's probably going to be on Twitter in half an hour's time. So, but it was not me that said that. It was one of my colleagues. Look, it's too early to tell. Too early to say. It's a bit like when Nixon went to China and was discussing with Chairman Mao what was the impact of the French Revolution, and Mao said it's too early to tell. Too early to say. I think we're in the same situation with Mercosur. It's very difficult. Look. We have a very, very active trade agenda, as Louis Hinson said. By 2030, I expect well over half of our agri-food trade, our trade, will be preferential, for good or bad. The only major partners with whom we will not have trade agreements will be, I expect, USA, Russia, and China. We will cover the rest of the world. That will include Mercosur. It may take a bit more time than planned, because, as you've all noted, the sustainability dimension of trade policy now does slow things down. It creates concerns. It's not easy. And we have, to about 10 years ago, we consciously tried to keep non-trade issues out of our trade policy, out of our agreements. Yeah, we didn't want to have them hijacked, if you like. The world has changed, as Louis Hinson said. We must use our trade policy now as a means to an end, not just an end in itself, a means to improve food security and a means to promote our sustainability agenda globally, using the fact that Europe is a very attractive market for other countries. Now, we've been quite successful so far with Australia, with New Zealand, with others in having quite a good sustainability agenda and chapters and commitments, binding commitments in our trade agreements. The test of this will be Mercosur, and further down the road, India and Indonesia, who are very concerned about green protectionism and an unfair level playing field approach. But I think we have no choice. So we have to use our trade policy to try to promote these sustainability goals, because it's the future of the planet that depends on that. We're a bit like the dog that was always chasing a bus, and then one day it caught the bus and didn't know what to do with the bus once it caught the bus. So I think we are stuck with the bus. We have to use our trade agreements, our trade policy, in the best way possible to pursue sustainability. Mercosur, it's not the test case, but it's going to be a very important example of what we can and cannot do in a climate where, even inside the European Union, there's a lot of pushback now against our green environmental climate agenda. It's not just third countries who are concerned. I mean, in Europe, this green agenda is playing into right-wing populism. There are many people, many political leaders in Europe are saying, let's put the brakes a little bit on the Green Deal and all the things that flow from that. And that's a reality we have to try and manage in the years ahead.
Totally. And so if I understand correctly, when it comes to Mercosur, like, of course, it's a test, but it's not a test because it's a very special deal. But maybe 2030 is a good chronological time horizon to, so it's not for this year, if I understand correctly, what you were saying about the fact that in 2030 we will have trade deals with everyone except US, Russia, and China.
That'll be in force. Mercosur, look, if we can conclude politically by the end of the year, great. In any case, given the slow way in which the European Union works in terms of getting trade agreements through the Commission, through the Council, through the Parliament, in any case, in the best case scenario, the Mercosur agreement could only be adopted by the legislators and enter into force at the earliest, I would say, 2025, 2026.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And you were talking about populism and the politics of trade deals. And I was wondering whether, with the European Parliament elections coming next year, shall we expect again a political debate around trade deals, kind of backlash, the same that we have against green policies? We might have it about trade against trade deals, or against maybe too many greens provisions in trade deals. And Christine, I was wondering, what was your opinion on that? Do you feel that trade and the agriculture interests that are related to trade deals could be back on the stage as European elections approach?
Well, this is a big question. I'm not Mafalda to anticipate everything, but I think that we need to ensure a certain continuity in order to show that we are serious. We need to implement the current engagement, trade engagement. We need to work very strong in order to influence and to convince our partners that we offer the best high quality standards. And we need to have this kind of continuity. I'm very convinced about this issue because we cannot make trade agreements in this kind of political span of time. We need of European Parliament or of European Commission. We need to to engage on a long-term period, and we need to consider the agenda 2030. We have also a lot of work on digitalization, on true things, in order that this trade becomes a reality of something which is obvious, in order to influence, to create global standards for like-minded countries, or something like this, in order to create this kind of convergence of standards.
And I was wondering, because of course there is the politics, but then there is also the point of view of companies. And you were saying, Luis, that your organization is you have many members, so of course they have common interests, but at the same time, maybe not always the same one. And I was wondering, just to go back again on the Mercosur deal, is it a deal that you're closely watching, and do you feel that if negotiations get stuck again, as they've been for years, that would kind of spare some uncertainty in the food and drink sector and some concerns?
Yeah, we're watching these agreements for a long time, and individual sectors within the industry probably even much closer than we are, either from an offensive side or a sensitive side.
Yeah.
And I mean, everyone here who deals with trade and agri-food will know which ones those are. And I mean, these sensitivities haven't changed. And I mean, having John here on the panel as a trade negotiator with so much experience, these choices need to be made at the end of the day, at the end of a negotiation, right? There's so many interests at stake, so many industry interests. You're looking for the best result for the European Union in a negotiation, not for an individual industry, but for all industries. Yep. And you have to strike a balance, and it's about mutual gains in both directions. So, yeah, Mercosur is a very specific example. I would say there are perhaps other agreements where we would be more offensive across the line, but yeah, it's more on a case-by-case basis, and these sensitivities are usually also very known to our EU trade policy negotiators and also taking into account. If I may, I want to bounce back on a,
yes, please.
On a point we touched upon, international cooperation when it comes to additional provisions, sustainability measures, which I find also tremendously important. to kind of involve trading partners from an early stage in a reflection process of what may be going on domestically within the European Union, or for that matter in other regions of the world, to sit at the table at an early stage to talk through things. Because, yeah, I mean, we read about trade policy and some of these measures developed here or elsewhere. Often it's not so much an issue with the objectives as such, and on which most people would even agree on in countries and regions of the world, but it's often a matter of perception and more about the approach. So maybe something can be done about this, be it via international organizations such as the World Trade Organization. There's a Trade and Environmental Committee in the WTO in Geneva, for instance. There are bodies like the FAO, the Codex Alimentarius, which is tremendously important when it comes to standard setting for food products and in international trade. So a lot exists already there. Yeah. I think it's maybe just a matter of bringing these different entities together and to discuss and come to the table. A final point, you mentioned the European elections 2024. We just launched a campaign this summer, our key policy ask ahead of the 2024 EU elections next year. And as I explained, given the importance of trade, trade is also one of the key asks that we have, specifically coming out of this context, and everybody will know it here, with the COVID pandemic, with the war in Ukraine, the repercussions we saw on supply chains, and despite that, an agri-food sector in the European Union which has remained very resilient nevertheless. But we've come to realize that the reality of how agri-food supply chains function, a lot of people didn't know that really, how complex it is and how much effort it takes and how many interlocutors are involved. And I think coming to that realization is also giving a bit of a boost, I would say, to a more positive outlook and a bigger attention to the importance of international trade. And I think that's a message that we would also want to carry on.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be very interesting indeed to see how the debate around trade will evolve as elections approach. And Jean-Marie, you were insisting before on the fact that, of course, our panel is on trade deals, but trade policy is a lot broader than that, and subsidies are really the key issue there, especially when it comes to the agriculture sector. So you were also mentioning how heterogeneous are the members of the WTO, and I was wondering how difficult it is, especially on this file, the file of agricultural subsidies, to work with countries such as China or such as others. Like, do you feel that the WTO has done much progress in trying to find the right language and the right negotiating process with China, for instance?
Well, we hope to move, and we need to move, because these are issues from the past. They are still very relevant to world trade, but till we solve them, we cannot move to other issues, including the one that you are mentioning here about sustainability. It's very difficult. It's very difficult for several reasons. Two of them are really outstanding. The first one is that there is a very great divide, and which has not been bridged yet, on the notion, for instance, of food security. How best to achieve your food security? Is it by subsidizing your production or growing your production, or is it by opening your trade to diversification and supply? And probably the answer is a mix of both, because you do not have one tool which catches all. But where do you put the needle between those two types of policies is not a matter of consensus. The other reason is that you've got a lot of asymmetries inherited from history about the level of subsidies that countries are entitled to. Basically, when the Uruguay round was concluded, the rich guys were subsidizing. So they were recognized a certain level of entitlement. And developing countries at this time were just recognized a flat percentage of their production. And now this asymmetry has been built. So developing countries which have emerged now say we need to rebalance that. And it is very difficult to try to organize a discussion in terms of who moves first. It's not that the rich countries do not understand that they need to rebalance a little more, but who moves first? And so these are the type of difficulties that we have. We hope that we can make a significant step forward at our next ministerial in next February.
Thank you. And just to maybe go back, we can go back to China a bit later, but before moving to that part of our discussion, I was wondering when it comes to environmental standards, like we often hear, especially in France, this idea that our trade partners should stick to our standards, and this concept of mirror clauses, for example, it has been really a mantra during the French presidency of the Council of the EU. I was wondering from you, John, I mean, we know that this concept means several things, but we know especially that it means regulation, having very strong regulation. Do you think that the word itself, mirror clauses, isn't it misleading because it kind of makes us think that it's something that we negotiate in free trade agreement when it's not the case?
Well, as politicians say, I'm glad you asked me that question. This is a very difficult issue to both deal with and also to explain to the European public. To some extent, but not all the way, to some extent we can, in principle, insist that our partners around the world adopt and apply our production standards. There is some leeway in the WTO rules that allows that. For example, if the production standards are damaging to the global environment, they cause deforestation or greenhouse gas emissions, then we can, under WTO law, we can say, sorry, you've got to follow the same high standards that we have, or equivalent. Similarly with animal welfare standards.
Yep.
If there is a genuine societal concern in Europe about inhuman or very bad animal treatment in third countries, we can insist, sorry, we will only import your products, your meat products, if you observe high animal welfare standards equivalent to ours. That, again, is legitimate. But it probably stops there. We cannot simply decide that we don't like the way that a country grows his soya or his cocoa or coffee and insist that that country simply adopts our own standards. They may be unsuitable for the conditions of the other country. And particularly developing countries, they have a very different calculus from Europe. Yeah? For them, the priority is poverty reduction. Perhaps local environmental protection is not so much a priority for them. It's feeding people, as it was for us 100 years ago. So we have to really avoid allowing this clause miroir concept to become a new kind of neo-colonialism. I think it's a very, very big risk. But it's very, very difficult to explain to European farmers in particular why it is that imports can be produced using certain pesticides that are banned in Europe, and they can't use these pesticides anymore. I try with limited success, I must say, to explain this. But in the end, I think we would not want it as producers, as exporters. We would not find it acceptable that we can only export to the United States or Norway or China if we apply US or Norwegian or Chinese standards. It would be regarded as an unacceptable interference in our sovereignty. So we have to be consistent.
It's very interesting what you're saying, and I was wondering whether you think that it can be a cover for neocolonialism, but also for protectionism sometimes. Do you feel that, the question I was asking to Christina, that with the upcoming European Parliament election, we can see an instrumentalization of trade policy, and we can see again some populist parties describing this as something that is harming European farmers? Are you expecting that kind of debate in the coming months?
Well, this debate has been growing over the last, ever since the Seattle WTO ministerial in whenever it was, Jean-Marie, 1999, where for the first time the world's public realized that trade policy actually does intervene in other policy areas, and that it's not a kind of a hermetically sealed area of itself. So ever since then, those of us in the trade policy community as negotiators, we've had to deal with this growing concern about trade, about standards, about protectionism. We at the moment are facing allegations in WTO and elsewhere of being green protectionists because of CBAM, because of the deforestation law, because of the forced labor regulation, because of the forthcoming due diligence regulation, the sustainability labeling regulation. I mean, the whole panoply of autonomous measures which are being introduced for extremely essential, existential and valuable purposes. The devil will be in the details with implementation, but the objectives are extremely worthy and necessary. But that does not assuage the concerns of developing countries who fear this European agenda. And as Louis Hinson was saying, and Christina as well, I think we have to deal with this not through coercion or through confrontation, but through dialogue, through cooperation, for developing country partners with assistance and financial support, so they can actually implement these higher standards which are good for the future of the planet.
Thank you. I mean, we see that confrontation, we kind of have it in the trade sphere recently in sectors other than the agricultural one. And it might seem a bit out of topic, but I think it is not. The probe that the European Commission has launched into Chinese electric vehicles. Why I'm saying this? Because the agricultural sector is often a collateral victim of other trade tensions, other trade disputes. So I was wondering, from your perspective, Luis, do you see, and we have that perception speaking sometimes with the industry, that there are some concerns of retaliation, especially, I mean, from China when it comes to your kind of sectors? I mean, we hear people, for example, in the luxury sectors telling us that indeed this kind of probe can be fair to tackle potentially illegal subsidies to Chinese cars, but then other sectors of the economy could be impacted. Do you have this kind of fear when it comes to this specific probe or to others?
I wouldn't say we only have that kind of fear. We have that experience from existing disputes, which haven't been permanently resolved. You said it, the US. We have the Section 232, steel and aluminium dispute, where retaliatory measures have been put in place against agri-food products. We have the Airbus-Boeing dispute, which is not permanently resolved yet. We, of course, were very happy that in 2021 there was a temporary suspension of these duties. Nevertheless, they could come back. They could snap back, especially for steel and aluminium. That could be already January next year, if no solution is found at this stage. I somehow have the impression that a European Union-US summit should go ahead soon in the second half of October. I don't know if that's confirmed yet, but that would certainly be one of our key asks to permanently resolve these disputes and really put aside permanently these retaliatory tariffs on agri-food products, which are sectors which are completely unrelated to the disputes. Now, coming back to China. China is a major trading partner for agri-food products. It ranks within our top 3. We've been doing extremely well. Of course, there are regulatory challenges that we have to deal with. We do that. We do that either as private sector or together with the European Union, who's helping us, having also a regulatory dialogue with Chinese counterparts on specific issues that is working very well. But we have seen from experience in the past that trade frictions in other sectors can backfire, especially on sectors which are particularly performing when it comes to international trade and exports and certain categories of products especially. So this is one we're watching very closely.
Totally. We are getting close to the end of our discussion. I will just ask a question from the audience. The EU considers itself to be the global leader in sustainable agriculture. Is it possible that, given its farmers are rewarded below average salaries, that is this failing on the innovation and technology piece that can underpin the economic leg of the sustainability 3 legs stool? It's a bit of a long question. I think that the main point is whether indeed the European Union is maybe lagging behind when it comes to innovation and technology in the field of sustainable agriculture. Maybe I would ask that to you, Christina, if you...
Well, I think that sustainability goes hand in hand with technology, with digitalization, and we have all over in our policy. We have even a program for digitalization. We had so many policies on digitalization, and it's very important. We have seen also the OECD, they have updated their guidelines in order to introduce consideration of due diligence and technology and climate change and so on. So we have revisited our rules in order to be in line with the innovation. Now we can, for example, technology helps us in traceability in agriculture, in monitoring animal diseases, in informing, in creating this kind of standardized database, which is so important to be used inside of the company, between companies, throughout the whole value chain. It is important to for our greening value chain. And now, since we speak about digitalization, I can also give you the example of, for example, what was happening in G20 and G7. At the level of G20, we put a lot of emphasis on this kind of digital public infrastructure, which is important not only for eradicating the poverty, but also for this kind of measurement, verification of CO2, emission of CO2. So now, to conclude, I would say, to answer to your question, it reminds me a little bit this kind of film, Interstellar. I don't know if you have seen it, but it's a film about sustainability and food security. And in this movie, many species were wiped by not from a blight, but from key issues which we are confronted today, like climate change, like poor land management. And the question is, can we let the sustainability be and the world manage its sustainability by itself? Of course, this is a rhetorical question. We cannot. We have a lot of responsibility at this level of innovation and sustainability.
Totally, yeah. I think that we can all agree that the question to that question is, of course, that we cannot let things be as they are. So unfortunately, we will finish this discussion. So thanks a lot. I'm happy that we touched upon several topics, and I leave the floor to Politico's trade editor, Douglas Busvin, who will conclude the event. So thank you very much for attending.
Thank you. Right. Great to see so many of you still here. We have come to the end of a fascinating day of interviews, discussions that have been enormously enlightening for me as a first-time participant in the Future of Food and Farming Summit. I hope those on-record sessions, informal debates, and all that networking in the breaks has also been worth your time. So what are the takeaways? Well, there's a lot. Certainly that the Common Agricultural Policy in its current form is not fit for purpose. And if we think forward to the prospective accession of Ukraine to the European Union, then a fundamental change will be necessary to accommodate that development. Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union address has marked an important shift away, I think, from a rather confrontational political atmosphere on the green agenda. She's pushing a dialogue, and we've heard today that although the details are pretty sketchy, the Commission is quite keen to get a move on that. So I guess we should expect something to happen before rather than after next year's elections. On pesticides, we've heard a few voices from Germany, from Lithuania, that the SUR, the proposed pesticide reduction law, is maybe not viable in its current form. And although the proposal on new genomic techniques has been generally well received, that is not universally the case. The socialist rapporteur on the file has said they are the new GMOs. Well, yes, the average farmer, or the typical farmer, is a 57-year-old man, kind of like me. So for the farming to have a future, a way needs to be found for younger and more diverse people to get involved. And also a big question mark over whether the EU's response to the impact on food security of the war in Ukraine was sufficient. And environmental derogations, we've heard, may have led to an increase in production of feed for animals and not necessarily food for human beings. So, and finally, the point from the panel I moderated, are more sustainable farming and food possible in these troubled and inflationary times? Now, there's no doubt that things are getting tougher there, and with elections not just in Europe but also in Britain and the United States looming next year, policy progress could get very difficult. We'll know more in a year's time, so we look forward to welcoming you again at the Future of Food and Farming Summit 2024 edition. And to wrap it up, I'd like to thank the speakers who made this day so fascinating, I should say, and our partners for making this summit possible, the leading partners, Bayer over there, and the visibility partner, the European Council of Young Farmers, not journalists, the European Council of Young Farmers. You know what I'm thinking about now. And now for the most important announcement of the day. You are, of course, invited to join us for an after-hours cocktail reception in the courtyard. We look forward to seeing you there. I've been Doug Busvine, the Politico Agriculture, Food and Trade Editor. Have a great evening and see you outside. Thank you very much.